Okay, I'm sat today on Skype rather than sat in person with Knut Melvar from Bergen in Norway. Hi, Knut.
Hi. Good day to you.
Thanks. And I've got a lot of questions I wanted to ask you, and I've been very interested in your research. But the big question, I think, is how did this term spirituality that was established by the authors of these kind of the Pauline epistles and the church fathers, it's an old term that's got a kind of long history. How did it end up in the name of my course, Emerging Spiritualities, dealing with New Age, neo-pagans, UFO religions? How did we end up with spirituality for all this when it meant something so traditional and ancient?
Well, that's a pretty daunting question, and I suggested it to you, but I immediately regretted it, because here you have nearly 1900 years of history to go through. But yeah, the reason I wanted you to ask me that question was that I had to sort of ask myself that question when I started my thesis work. Which is on the history of the concept spirituality in Norway in the 20th century, right? And to my surprise, there hasn't actually been that much research on that history.
So it's a term that actually, we think it's quite a recent term, but it goes way back.
It does. So most authors claim that its etymology is in the Pauline epistles or the Pauline letters, right? In the New Testament, where in the translation of the Greek manuscripts, you go from the Greek pneuma into the Latin spiritus, right?
Yeah.
And spiritus is sort of the root of the word spirituality. But in fact, the term pneuma or pneumatikos was used by Greek philosophers way before Paul.
Yeah.
So where to set the starting point, it's a bit difficult, but most agree that Paul is sort of the originator of the term.
So it goes back at least as far as that, but actually there is evidence to believe that he might have been using a term that's in common usage or is used elsewhere.
Yeah, I believe so, because most of the work done on the conceptual history of this term is done by theologians, and they will probably start with Paul, right?
Yeah.
But as we know, Paul, or the authors of the Pauline letters, they were aware of Greek philosophy, well aware.
Yeah.
And you find several different concepts of pneuma among the Stoics, in Plato, Aristotle, and stuff like that. So, yeah.
So it goes back to there, but it clearly predates it in some sense or other, and that gives us half the story. The other half of the story is, so we find it in the New Testament in those letters, but then we still find it today in people. If I go into my local bookshop, I'll find books and books on New Age spirituality, and whole shelves of them, and the New Age fairs that you've been attending as part of your research. New Age spirituality is it's the preferred term. So there's something about how did it get from there to where we find it now.
Yeah.
That's a long story to ask you a big question for a short answer, but
it's a long story, but sort of a brief story or brief history, because we haven't so many sources between modern times and Paul, right? And most of those sources is by church fathers and different Christian authors, and it's a bit scarce. And up till the 17th century, this term wasn't that much used. But yeah, I can go swiftly through it if you want.
Sure.
Just stop me if it gets tedious or a bit boring.
I
But
can't imagine that, but go on.
the first sort of nounification of the term spiritus, right, is found in a letter probably written by Pelagius in I think it was the 4th century, where he writes, and I'm gonna butcher this Latin pronunciation.
Go for it.
Age ut in spiritualitate proficias, which means to act to progress in spirituality. Here we have this sort of first nounification of spiritus. And from here, you have some sources that begin to make dichotomy between the spiritual and the material. Actually, if you read Paul doesn't really make an opposition between the material and the spiritual. It's distinct but not opposed, right?
Yeah, it's quite hard to find that dualism in Paul that we imagine is there.
Yeah,
Isn't necessarily.
yeah. And that's probably why some theologians claims that that Paul was inspired by Stoicism and stuff like that. But yeah, back to the history or the emerging history. So up to modern times, most texts are written in Latin, right? And you slowly get this sort of sense of the spiritual being opposed to material. You also got this use of the term when talking about jurisdiction, right? To differ between the churchly jurisdiction and the sort of secular jurisdiction. I think you even got that distinction in the UK Parliament today. Lord's spiritual,
yes,
and
that's right.
Lord's temporal, right?
Yeah.
Yeah. And then you got this sort of new break in the history where a monk called Candidus sort of conceptualizes this as something within the human psyche, which reminds us slightly of the modern conception. And in the 17th century in France, you start to get more literature in French and not in Latin that uses this word, and it becomes a part of the vernacular, and sort of the use of it sort of explodes, or mildly explodes, if you want. Yeah. So here you have the sort of the root of the modern use of it.
And then we find it in our modern use used probably in only the last 50 years very strongly to distinguish something separate from the religious.
Yeah.
That's a relatively kind of new, kind of innovative way of drawing a distinction between the religious and the spiritual life as somehow not being the same thing.
Yeah, and up to the 17th century, it was only used within Christianity, sort of. But in the 17th century, you have French and English philosophers that sort of begin to elaborate on it, and even this was an interesting tidbit. It was used about Quietism, which was a Christian denomination movement, which reminds me a little bit of New Age stuff, because they favored silence over prayer and meditation and all that stuff, and they were claimed to be a new spirituality, but also heretics, right?
Yeah.
So here you begin to see the identity politics of spirituality, sort of. Those are not the original spirituality. That's a new kind and limited kind of spirituality. So that was a bit exciting. and it also becomes an entry in the first official French dictionary. And it is broadly used within the dictionary as well. Several words have sort of an spiritual meaning.
Right.
So here you see sort of it catches on. Yeah.
And that takes us, I think, largely, I think we see that usage, and that suddenly falls into line with the usage that we see now.
Could you?
Yeah, I was just saying, I think that
Yeah.
that French use and that use you were giving an example of is very similar to the use that we see now.
Yeah, it is absolutely, and yeah, even I found it in the entry for Caliph. I saw you had a video about the Caliphate earlier, where Caliph is defined as the successive ruler after Muhammad with temporal and spiritual power.
Yeah.
Which in 1700 so that was a bit interesting, I think.
That has a very modern ring to it.
Yeah.
That sounds very contemporary. Okay, well, I think that's given us a real insight into the historical development of the term spirituality. Thank you, Knut.